So in the first lesson on ecology that you will have studied in class, you'll have realised that ecology is a topic that contains a lot of key words, and the first lesson's content you will have looked at will have been on ecosystems. Now, in terms of ecosystems, it's worth bearing in mind what some of the key words that are associated with ecosystems and ecology mean, because it gives you a lot of better understanding about how different organisms interact within an environment. So, start off with the idea of what an ecosystem is. Now, the definition for an ecosystem is the interactions of all the living and non-living parts of an environment. Okay? So that's the definition of an ecosystem. Now, there are other words within an ecosystem that are worth bearing in mind, and the next one within that layer is a community. Now, a community is a group of living organisms that coexist within an ecosystem. Now, those living organisms can be made up of different species, different types of fish, crab, jellyfish, as that diagram shows. Now, a species, in terms of its definition, is an organism or organisms that interbreed to make fertile offspring. Now, the word fertile means, obviously, it's able to reproduce. So it's an organism that can breed, that makes offspring that can also breed and reproduce. Now, the terms associated with species are obviously an individual and a population. So when we're talking about an individual, we're talking about one organism of a species. A dog, a cat, a fish, a monkey, etc. Now, when we're talking about a population, we're talking about the number of a specific species within an area, so within an ecosystem. So, for example, the number of goldfish is shown on that diagram. Now, one of the things about ecology is all about the interactions of organisms. So, one of the key terms to bear in mind when you're studying ecology is this idea of interdependence. Now, interdependence is when different organisms depend on each other for survival. So, if you think about an ecosystem, such as a rock pool, I think as that diagram might shows, any major change to that ecosystem can have far-reaching effects on different organisms if they survive, if they rely on other organisms for survival. Now, when you have a state of interdependence that is stable and works, we often say that an ecosystem is at equilibrium, or it's balanced. Now, numbers of different organisms might go up and down over time, but over time, in terms of a general trend, the population sizes remain fairly constant. So we describe those populations within an ecosystem at equilibrium as being stable communities. Now, ecosystems where this kind of thing happens are often things like tropical rainforests and ancient woodland. Now, when we talk about interdependence, as we said, different organisms depend on each other for survival. We've also got to bear in mind what organisms need to survive. So we're thinking things like food, shelter, water, reproductive mates, things like that. Now, within ecosystems, there are often not enough resources to go around, so organisms compete with each other. Now, definition of competition is an interaction between organisms to gain a share of a limited environmental resource needed for survival. So that means organisms, basically, when we're talking about an interaction, we might be saying, polite way of saying they have a fight. So if you think, I don't know, male lions fighting each other to see who's head of the herd, so they get the best reproductive mates in terms of lionesses. So they basically have a fight to gain a share of a limited environmental resource. So that's something around them that they need for survival. So food might be plants, it might be being a dominant predator, so they get to eat all the prey. It might be water, it might be some sort of shelter that they need to get. And if they can survive, what does that mean they're most likely to do? They're more likely to reproduce. So that's the basis of competition within an ecosystem. Now, if you think about things that could affect competition, so for example, you might bring in new predators into a ecosystem that's stable, that's at equilibrium, that's balanced, and then they might eat more of the prey that's available to other animals, which means that ecosystem might go out of balance, and that might affect the numbers of a population, which if they are then depended on by another, will also affect those as well. So that's where we start to get all these ideas interlinked. But don't over confuse things for now. Just think of those definitions to start with. Now, competition, interaction between organisms where they try and get the most out of an environmental resource they need for survival so they can reproduce. Equilibrium, when an ecosystem is at equilibrium, it's balanced, which means the populations of different organisms within community are relatively stable. Interdependence, organisms depend on others for survival. So that might be depending on one for shelter or a prey that it eats, which is the main source of food. And then species, organisms that interbreed to make a fertile offspring. A community is a group of living organisms that coexist in an ecosystem or interactions of living and non-living parts of an environment. So your main takeaway from your first lesson in ecology needs to be about those definitions of those keywords. Make sure you make a note of them somewhere.